Welcome, everybody, to Edgar Allan Poe's Haunting Afterlife. I'm Sheila Budoff with Arlington County's 55 Plus program. This program is being recorded and it will be posted on Arlington County's 55 Plus YouTube channel at a later date. Our speaker will be spotlighted so that only his image appears in the recording. The program is coming to you through the Virtual Center for Active Adults platform. It's a partnership of Northern Virginia jurisdictions that have joined together to provide free virtual programming for older adults and adults with disabilities. Many thanks to Nicole Waller for all that she does to provide these virtual programs for us through the VCAA platform. Also, many thanks to Charlika Ashton, the supervisor of Arlington's virtual programming, for her creativity, vision, and management of Arlington's virtual programs. I'm also delighted to be partnering once again with Bridget Wisdom, Arlington Public Library Associate, and together we're doing this so that we can bring the program to even more of our local residents. Please plan to join Bridget Wisdom on October 26th for a session on how to get the free Libby app so that you can read library books on your phone or another mobile device. That's going to be October 26th from 1:30 to 2:30. And also Bridget and I are going to be collaborating again on a book talk with Virginia historian John Moss, who will be discussing his new book, George Washington's Virginia. The program is going to be on September 28th, and we're trying something a little new. It will be in the evening, beginning at 7 p.m. So that's going to be a collaboration with the library as well. And a heads up to everybody, the new Arlington County program guide covering fall programs, September, October, and November, will be coming out on Wednesday, August 10th. Be on the lookout for it in an e-newsletter. And registration for these and other great programs and trips will begin on Wednesday, August 17th at 10 a.m. for Arlington residents and Thursday, August 18th for out-of-county residents. And now I am very honored and very delighted to introduce our guest speaker for this afternoon, Christopher Semtner. Chris Semtner is an internationally exhibited artist and author. His paintings are included in numerous public collections, including at the Virginia Historical Society and the University of Maryland. He is also the curator of the Edgar Allan Poe Museum in Richmond. He has curated critically acclaimed exhibits for museums and galleries across the country with his Library of Virginia exhibit called Poe, Man, Myth, or Monster. His exhibits for the Poe Museum have brought that institution numerous awards and honors. Chris has written several books, chapters, and articles on a range of topics, including literature, visual art, history, and of course, Edgar Allan Poe. Also, in search of innovative ways to bring Poe to new audiences, Chris has collaborated on Poe-themed performances with groups including the Latin Ballet of Virginia, Friends of the Shockoe Hill Cemetery, and Engaging History Productions. He has appeared on BBC4, PBS, the Travel Channel, Military History, NPR, CNN, and other networks, and has been featured in the New York Times and Forbes. He regularly speaks about strange and macabre subjects at various venues, from the Steampunk World's Fair to the Library of Congress and as far away as Kyoto, Japan. Today, he's going to discuss his most recent book about Edgar Allan Poe. This one focusing on Poe's very active afterlife, entitled Haunting Poe, His Afterlife in Richmond and Beyond. Please hold your questions until the end of the presentation. You're most welcome to enter questions in the chat as we go, but we will be holding them until the end. And also at that point, if you'd like to just unmute yourself and ask your question, that would work as well. So without further ado, I am going to turn this over to Chris Semtner.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me. It's always great to talk about Poe in different places. And I'm just down the road a bit in Richmond, Virginia at the Edgar Allan Poe Museum. So if you ever have the opportunity, you should just come on down. And I regret today that the weather didn't quite cooperate with us. At least today it's bright and sunny outside. The birds are singing and it's not quite getting us in the Poe mood. So maybe just a little bit of the Raven will get us in that right state of mind. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary o'er many quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping on a midnight, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. And that's the opening to Poe's best known poem, the only poem that's so popular it has an NFL team named after it. There's also a Raven beer. If you do buy the beer, the bottles have a picture of Poe, and the tagline is, "The taste is poetic." We get a lot of bad Poe puns in the Poe community, so you'll have to watch out for those. You have to forgive me if I slip in the occasional bad Poe pun. But this is the author of The Telltale Heart, of The Cask of Amontillado, The Black Cat. He's one of the best known horror writers. Even though he only wrote about 15 horror stories out of 70 stories total, he actually preferred his comedies a lot of times. The only problem is nobody else prefers his comedies. But he wrote the first detective story, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, followed up with a series of detective stories like The Purloined Letter, The Mystery of Roger, and The Gold Bug, and Thou Art the Man. Also wrote science fiction about trips to the moon. But Poe is always associated with horror. So that's why every year around Halloween time, people break out their Poe and they give their greatest renditions of The Telltale Heart. So naturally, people start to wonder, is Poe's spirit still out there stalking us? Of all the people who should be a ghost, shouldn't Edgar Allan Poe, wouldn't he have the most fun in it? Wouldn't he be the creepiest ghost you could imagine? And believe it or not, people claim that they've spotted him up and down the East Coast, no fewer than 7 different cities. He supposedly is a regular at 3 different bars. Even one of them saves a stool for him in case he ever comes back. So the genesis of this book was just trying to track down the ghostly legends and lore associated with Poe. Like, how many people, where were they, who claimed to have seen Poe's spirit over the years? And it just so happened that his death coincided with the birth of spiritualism. And you might have heard a little bit about the spiritualist movement. These were people who were holding seances in which they tried to communicate with the dead through the help of a medium, a person who served as the medium of communication. They compared this person to a telegraph. They were carrying the message to the living. And just carrying a message wasn't enough. So in the later stages of spiritualism, they started lifting tables and throwing things around the room and saying, look, this is evidence of spiritual powers, even sometimes manifesting a ghostly presence who looked a whole lot like one of the spectators at the event. And of course, this has been picked up by popular culture. So even today, there's people who are embracing the hunt for evidence of the afterlife, but this is nothing new. This is something that they're even searching for in Poe's time. Now, in Poe's time, life expectancies were suddenly getting longer. You went from the 18th century, where you had high infant mortality rates, to the 19th century, where you had about a 1 in 4 chance of surviving past infancy, which was, or 3 in 4 chances of surviving past infancy. So a lot better odds of surviving. Only 1 in 6 women was died in childbirth. So that's a lot better, even though they still didn't know about antibiotics. They still didn't know about modern medicine, but it was getting a lot safer to live. This wasn't the colonial era United States. This was the more cosmopolitan world where you get a lot of immigration. The cities were growing. And in Poe's day, they started devoting a lot more time to mourning and contemplating death. And there's entire books they published with just mourning poetry, just poetry about the proper way to grieve one's loved ones. They produced mourning art. It became a favorite topic for fashion magazines. Look, this is the Family Mourning Warehouse, the best place to go in all of London to get the best mourning outfits. And Poe is no stranger to this. One of his earliest poems is Spirits of the Dead. Thy soul shall find itself alone mid dark thoughts of the gray tombstone. Not one of all the crowd to pry and tune thine hour of secrecy. Be silent in that solitude, which is not loneliness. For then the spirits of the dead who stood in life before thee are again in death around thee, and their wills shall overshadow thee. Be still. And here's our little recreation of it using the Poe Museum's own cats, Edgar and Pluto, as the spirits of the dead. But Poe is just one of many people exploring what happens in the afterlife, looking at other cultures and other traditions to find out their answers. And Poe is very interested in studying the literature of the Middle East. And he used Al-Araf. His second published book contains a long poem, about 500 lines, called Al-Araf, and it's based on an Eastern tradition of the afterlife. And basically, he says it's something like limbo, that's neither heaven nor hell, and he places it on a star. So he's even bringing astronomy into this and saying there was a star that was seen once in the 1600s and almost immediately disappeared and never been seen again. So he places Al-Araf on a star, and this is where spirits from all the different planets in the galaxy go when they're waiting to be assigned either heaven or earth, or heaven or hell. And his poem centers upon the ghost, the spirit of Michelangelo, who's joined by a spirit from another planet. And they decide that Al-Araf is a place of perfect beauty and heaven's a place of perfect knowledge. So if you leave Al-Araf to go to heaven, then you're just going to have perfect knowledge, but you'll lose that beauty. So Michelangelo and the other spirit decide they're going to stay in Al-Araf forever. Yeah, that's kind of the gist of the poem. People back then didn't make much sense of it either. One critic said it looked like somebody's just written a bunch of verses on scraps of paper and thrown them up in the air, let them land wherever they may. One critic said, well, this poem is nonsense, but it's exquisite nonsense. And I think the best review was, there was a critic named N.P. Willis who wrote that the thing he most enjoyed about this poetry was seeing it burn up in his fireplace. But that just shows you where Poe's mind was when he's about 20 years old, publishing his second book of poetry. And he was also hearing about traditions that were spreading across the United States during this age. One of them was Swedenborgianism. Emanuel Swedenborg was from Sweden, and he was a scientist and a philosopher and a mystic. And he believed that he'd had mystic encounters, that he could leave his body and communicate with spirits from other times, ancient scientists like Galen, or spirits from other planets. So he had his own theories about life and the afterlife, and these were starting to gain in popularity in Poe's day. A lot of people, the general public, thought, well, this is sort of weird and far out there. But in some of Poe's early stories, Morella, Ligeia, Eleonora, all stories about women who find ways to come back from the dead. He describes these women as Swedenborgianisms, that they're accessing the secret knowledge of Swedenborgianism and learning ways to come back from the dead, learning ways to conquer death. In fact, Ligeia, who's in the center illustration, says, we do not succumb wholly to death, but by weakness of the will. So if we can have strong enough willpower, we can conquer death. And the knowledge must lie in these old tomes that she reads through, studying, trying to devise ways to come back. And these aren't your typical ghost stories. In Morella, a woman dies in childbirth, but she hates her husband. She threatens she'll come back by possessing her newborn daughter. So the husband in the story is actually terrified of his own daughter, terrified of even giving her a name, because he's worried that Morella's soul lives within her. And Ligeia, the lovely Ligeia, she perishes, but As she dies, she promises she's going to come back, but her husband, soon after her death, he goes, he marries another woman, and Ligeia is able to come back by possessing the second wife. And Eleonora, a woman, once again, madly in love with this man, but when she dies, she makes him promise she'll never marry again. And of course, he keeps the promise for a while, and then she comes back. So those are typical narratives, but he also did sort of spiritual dialogue, the conversation of Eros and Carmine, the colloquy of Onos and Una. These are ones you probably haven't read, but they're in the form of dialogues. It almost looks like a script. And these are more contemplations on the afterlife told from the point of view of spirits in the afterlife. And the colloquy of Monos and Una, the newly dead one is describing what it was like to go from being a being to a place, to being part of the atmosphere, and what that transition is like. And even in The Raven, we have these contemplations of the afterlife. Although in Poe, it's not necessarily a heaven we'd want to go to. Tell this soul with sorrow laden, if within the distant Aiden it shall clasp the sainted maiden whom the angel named Lenore, nameless here forevermore. That quoth the Raven, nevermore, we'll never return to our lost Lenore. And other poems, he gets a little bit more explicit in The Sleeper. Oh, the lady sleeps, soft around her may the worms creep. So it's a love poem about a decomposing corpse. It's, yeah, even people in Poe's day thought that was a little bit in bad taste. So what are our other solutions back then? What are other miracle ideas and philosophies? One of them, Anton Mesmer, you see right here, he developed a theory of animal magnetism, that all beings and all objects have magnetic currents flowing through them. And all we had to do was tap into those currents, and we could heal the sick. We could control their minds and even step outside their body, because it was believed by some that when you were in a mesmeric trance, so named after Mesmer, that you actually could leave your body and you could see other spirits while you're outside your body. There was nothing to prevent you from being the others, communicate with the other spirits around you. Now, once again, some people thought this was just a bunch of hokum and it was a parlor trick. But in Poe's day, about 1845, someone actually did conduct an operation, not by using anesthesia, but by mesmerizing them, mesmerizing the patient. So this was something that was gaining in popularity even during Poe's time. And in early 1845, there was an article in the American Review. It's called The Facts in the Case of M. Valdemar, about a fellow named Valdemar who was in his dying days, and some mesmerists asked if they could mesmerize him just before he died, maybe suspend the process of death, keep him alive. And they actually mesmerized him, but it didn't go quite as planned. These scientists were able to mesmerize him, but keep his mind alive after his body was obviously decaying. And they would ask it questions from time to time, and there's some ethereal voice would answer them. Although the mouth, the tongue, and everything wouldn't move, they'd hear a voice answering them from somewhere. And they kept this fellow, Mr. Valdemar, in this trance state for 7 months, until finally he'd been dead so long, he just asked them, please, please wake me, let me die, break this trance so I can finally die. And they broke him from his trance. They finally woke him up. And within the space of a few minutes, before their very eyes, he dissolved into a mass of loathsome, of detestable putrescence. And yeah, this was accepted as true story back then. People were buying the magazine to find out all about this miracle use of mesmerism, until several people pointed out that E.A. Poe that wrote it, you can't always trust him. Horace Greeley printed the New York Tribune that you'd have to have a very big bump of faith indeed to believe such hokum as this. So Poe wrote back in the Broadway Journal, an article of ours thus entitled, was published in the last number of Mr. Colton's American View, has given rise to some discussion, especially in regard to the truth or falsity of the statements made. It has not become us, of course, to offer one word on the pointed issue. We have been requested to reprint the article and do so with pleasure. We leave it to speak for itself. We may observe, however, that there are a certain class of people who pride themselves upon doubt as a profession. And another one of his statements, he said, well, these transcendentalists believe all these weird things, so why should it be more impossible to believe that you could mesmerize someone at the moment of death? And this is a pamphlet published in London shortly after the first United States printing. And the story is being reprinted on both sides of the Atlantic. This is called Mesmerism in Articulo Mortis, an astounding and horrifying narrative showing the extraordinary power of mesmerism in arresting the progress of death, by Edgar A. Poe, Esquire. And over there, it was reprinted in medical journals. It was reprinted in the Popular Record of Modern Science. And this became one of Poe's first big international hits. And the introduction to it says that the following astonishing narrative first appeared in the American magazine, a work of some standing in the United States, where the case has excited most intense interest. The effects of the mesmeric influence in this case are so astounding, so contrary to all past experience, that no one could have possibly anticipated the final result. The narrative, though only a plain recital of facts, is of so extraordinary a nature as almost to surpass belief. It is only necessary to add that credence is given to it in America, where the occurrence took place. So they're saying, everybody in America believes it, it must be true. And about this time, Poe met an actual mesmerist, a professional trance mesmerist named Andrew Jackson Davis. So Poe was born in 1809. Jackson Davis was born in 1826. So a little bit younger than Poe. And he was kind of, didn't have a lot of education, lived in the outskirts in the country. And he had this strange experience. He said that he went to bed at night and woke up miles away, almost 100 miles away, and that he could go into a trance state and communicate with spirits from other times and other places and learn the very nature of the afterlife. So he would go on stage and give these readings where he was communicating, he was asking ghost questions, and he had somebody on stage with him transcribing all of his messages. And in March of 1848, he had a message. He said that something has just happened that will shake the very foundations of our reality and religion, and nothing will be different after this. And about the same time he said that, somehow by strange coincidence, out in Hydesville, New York, these three girls started hearing strange knocking noises. They're just living in a cabin, and they claimed that they were speaking to a ghost named Mr. Jinx, and he would answer them by knocking, by making rapping sounds. And people couldn't find out how they were tapping. They weren't tapping their feet. They weren't knocking on the wall. How are they making these rapping noises? It must be a ghost, because these are pure, innocent children. They wouldn't deceive us. Before you know it, all these adults were going to see these young girls and asking them to help them learn about the afterlives. These are the Fox sisters. And they quickly became a phenomenon. There's Maggie, Leah, and Katie. And Leah sort of acted as the manager for the two younger sisters, but they were able to convince complete adults, even very intellectual men, that they couldn't possibly be faking these things. And sometimes they'd see most extraordinary things. A table or sofa would start to shake. These knocks were appearing from seemingly nowhere. Later, one of them confessed that she was just cracking the knuckles on her toes. I don't mean to ruin it for you, but so we can see that these three earlier figures, Swedenborg, Andrew Jackson Davis, and Mesmer, they at least prepared the way for the Fox sisters, and they prepared the way for a belief in some of the phenomenon they were producing. And the Fox sisters really popularized the spiritualist movement. They popularized the table tapping, the knockings. But Andrew Jackson Davis here, we tend to forget right there at the top center, he was considered the St. Paul of spiritualism. He's the one who actually wrote their basic teachings and philosophies. He said that the afterlife was a place called Summerland, where all people of all races and nationalities came together. And that these sisters, they were having these manifestations, but he was the one actually putting it all right. He published books, he even published a newspaper, sort of advertising what this movement is all about. But when we look at this, I also want to point out that we're missing the guy who influenced Andrew Jackson Davis, Edgar Allan Poe, with his stories about mesmerizing the dead. In addition to the facts in the case of M. Valdemar, there's also mesmeric revelation. And Jackson Davis, for his part, said that everything that Poe has written in these stories is absolutely true, even if Poe pretends are not true. He says Poe, in the back of his mind, must have known these stories are true. And in fact, they met in New York City about 1845, and Davis said that Poe, whether he knew or not, was followed around by a spirit like a dark shadow. So as the popularity of spiritualism increases, people were just trying to figure out, is this blasphemous? The Bible says you should beware of people trying to speak with the dead. I mean, how should we address this issue? And some equated spiritualism with witchcraft. Others are saying that spiritualism and Christianity can exist side by side. So some of them were embracing Davis's teachings, and others were rejecting it. So those people who seemed to embrace these new teachings were some of the people Poe might have known. Elizabeth Barrett Browning in the top left there. He actually dedicated his book, The Raven and Other Poems, to Elizabeth Barrett Browning. And he said she was one of his favorite poets. She wrote to him once, and he always used to bring out the letter at parties and say, "This is my letter from Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and I'll read it to you." Frances Sargent Osgood in the top middle was one of Poe's friends in New York City. They exchanged flirtatious love poetry. Sarah Helen Whitman, even Ralph Waldo Emerson. But as I said, the movement also had its critics, even among the literary scene. Tennyson, Dickens, even Rufus Griswold, who was Poe's literary executor and biographer, all thought this was a bunch of bunk. How can people be so gullible? And Poe continued, I don't think he really embraced spiritualism. I don't think he really believed this. And after a while, people were writing him, even spiritualists were writing Poe saying, now you've been pretending that the facts in the case of M. Valdemar is a hoax, but tell the truth. You're just pretending, right? It really is true. And he would say, well, my son, hoax really is the best word for it. I don't believe a word of it, and neither do you. Neither should you. But he was trying to make sense of how the world all fits together. And Poe's last book, this is the title page, is Eureka. Published a year before his death. It's Poe's Theory of Everything book. And it's dedicated to the few who love me and whom I love, to those who feel rather than those who think, to the dreamers who put faith in dreams as in the only realities. I offer this book of truths, not in the character of truth teller, but for the beauty that bounds in its truth, constituting it true. So this was Poe's theory that everything, it all started out from one very, very dense particle, so dense that it didn't exist. He said that, well, matter and energy are one. Space and time are one. So space, time, and energy are all one. If a particle is so dense that there's no space between the particles within it, there's no energy, there's no forces of attraction or repulsion. Therefore, there ends up being nothing. There's no space, no time, no nothing. And then all of a sudden, everything emerged. There's a big bang, and it all exploded out from that one source. So it's an early version of the Big Bang Theory, but Poe's way of describing, well, how could it have come from nothing, is that there's multiple universes. He believed in a big bang followed by a big crunch where eventually the universe would collapse in on itself, and then it would reappear again somewhere else. So every universe was just emerging from something else. There's an infinite number of these multiple universes. He described it as almost like the heartbeat of God, a universe contracting and then another universe expanding. And people at the time thought this was just blasphemous. How can you write something like this? And There's a woman Poe was seeing named Marie Louise Shue, and her pastor told her to save her soul, she would have to cut off all contact with them immediately. So she did. She just said, "You're bad for my soul. I can never speak to you again." And Poe concludes the book that by saying that if everything was once one, we're all one. All of our spirits are eventually going to be intertwined. Our spirits are all God. Everything is once life within life within life within more life. So that got him into more trouble. He thought this was the best thing he'd ever written. He wanted 50,000 copies printed, and Wiley and Putnam only printed 500. Gave him an advance of $14, which he probably didn't make on the sale of this book. So what about The Ghost of Poe? Well, that was his last book. This is where his mind was towards the end of his life. And I showed you briefly this fellow, Rufus Wilmot Griswold. He hated Poe, couldn't stand him. He was an editor and anthologist, published things like The Poets and Poetry of America, and made the mistake in this big book of American poetry, only including 3 of Poe's poems, while he's including dozens by Longfellow, 47 poems by Charles Fino Hoffman. And who's Charles Fino Hoffman? Exactly. He's kind of forgotten today, but he was one of Rufus Griswold's friends, so included lots of his poetry. So Poe called him out and said, Griswold's just including his friends' poetry in there. He's just puffing up his buddies. And Griswold doesn't know the first thing about poetry. So after Poe died, Griswold got back at him and wrote a biography that said Poe is a madman, drunk, a scoundrel. He's a despised figure. You should just absolutely hate him. And there's a 4-volume set of Griswold's edition of Poe's works with this biography. And it ended up, as soon as Griswold wrote the biography saying you should never read Poe's works again, he's horrible, he's awful, he's despicable, the complete work sold out in 3 editions in the first 6 months, made the more popular than any of his books during his lifetime. All of a sudden, Poe's bigger than ever, and he became a cult hero in France almost immediately. Mallarmé called him the divine madman drunkard of Baltimore as a compliment. Baudelaire thought, oh yeah, this guy is perfect for me. He drinks, he does drugs just like I do. Perfect role model. Although Griswold made up a lot of those stories. Poe didn't drink quite as much as Griswold said he did. And even one of Poe's enemies said, oh, in all the time I've known him, I've never seen any evidence of him having an opium habit. But while Griswold was working on this book, he invited the Fox sisters into his house. Horace Greeley, if you remember him earlier, he was a critic of Poe's story, The Facts in the Case of M. Valdemar. He was a friend of Griswold's, actually hired Griswold to write Poe's obituary, which started out, Edgar Poe is dead. This news will startle many, but few will be grieved by it. He had few or no friends. That's how he started out his obituary. So that's not a good start there. But Greeley was trying to popularize spiritualism by bringing the Fox sisters into New York City to meet the leading literary figures of the day. And they had a seance at Rufus Griswold's house just 5 months after Poe's death. And anybody who was there, James Fenimore Cooper was there. And Rufus Griswold, of course, N.P. Willis, the one who wrote the review saying that he liked to see Poe's poems burn up in the fire. So it was described as a leading literary clique that was showing up at this performance of this seance. And James Fenimore Cooper, apparently, he said that they just pretty much just sat in the darkness for hours, nothing happening. Occasionally heard a random knock. People would try to ask questions, and the sisters knocking would just get the answers wrong. Until finally Cooper said, now I want you to tell me, is this person I'm trying to contact a male or a female? And they gave the correct number of knocks. And then they asked, did they die from falling out a window, being struck by lightning, or falling off a horse, or drowning? And it gave the correct number of knocks and said yes. And then he asked, how long ago did this person die? And the sisters just started making random knocks, just going knocking, 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 until they said, could you slow down the knocks? I have to count them. So they had to start over again. And when they got to 50, the sisters stopped. And it worked out because James Fenimore Cooper's sister had died from falling from a horse 50 years earlier. So he sort of was convinced, but most of the people there weren't convinced. And here's Sarah Helen Whitman, one of Poe's fiancées. She lived in Providence, Rhode Island. Before she and Poe ever met, she'd sent him fan mail. She published a poem called To Edgar A. Poe about how she wanted to fly away with the raven to his nest up in the sky. So he dropped everything, went all the way from Richmond to Providence just to meet her. And they took a long romantic walk through the Swan Point Cemetery. And she said, "This is the grave of one of my lost loves. I like to visit it from time to time." And Poe said, "That's something we have in common. Back in Richmond, there's a grave of my first love that I like to visit. And in fact, when I was a teenager, I used to commune with her spirit on her grave." So she and Poe eventually became engaged, but she had one condition. She said, "If you ever touch alcohol again, the wedding's off." So they're engaged for 1 month. And after that, he never saw her again. That was 1848, the same year that he published Eureka, that book I told you about earlier, his Theory of Everything book. And when she heard that he had died, she was sitting in her room, contemplating everything she could have said. You know, those, how you start to ask questions. I should have said this differently. I should have said that. And she sort of asked a mental question, to which she heard a knock coming from the middle of the table right in front of her, even though she was alone. Then she asked another mental question, her a knock coming from behind her. Now another knock coming from over at the door. And she thought, this must be Poe's spirit trying to communicate with me. And she hired a medium to start moving in with her and help her communicate with Poe's death, communicate with Poe's spirit. So she hired one medium for a little while, another one for about 6 weeks to move in with her, to move into her home. And another trance medium. That's this part, goes back to Mesmer, going into a mesmeric trance. And while you're in that trance state, you can communicate with the spirits. But there's a twist. This one also transcribed the messages. So she would hear it and she would transcribe using automatic writing, whatever the spirit told her. And eventually Sarah Helen Whitman there became a professional medium. So she didn't have to hire a medium to live with her. She could become a medium. And this is a photograph of Sarah Helen Whitman, Poe's fiance, holding a seance. And at that time, she says that she received 3 spiritual letters from Poe. We don't know what they said. She hasn't revealed that, but people started writing her letters asking, "Can you pass this message on to Poe? Can you ask him this question? I want him to answer this question about his book, Eureka. It didn't make any sense." And she was seen as sort of the conduit for all these people's messages to get to Poe. And here's an illustration of a spiritual hand writing a message. Everyone at the table is holding hands, but somehow the message is being written in front of them. And this trance writing became very popular shortly after Poe's death. And starting in the 1850s, here was Lizzie Doden. She's just one of many writers who was saying that she was transcribing poetry sent to her by Edgar Allan Poe's spirit. And her most famous poem, supposedly written by him, was The Streets of Baltimore from 1864. But it sounds a little bit familiar to me. She said that she hasn't really read any of Poe's poetry. And, you know, she said, "I'm an uneducated woman. I don't know anything about poetry. All the experts are saying that it must be Poe because I wouldn't know any better. But woman weak and woman mortal, through the spirit's open portal, I would read the runic record of my earthly being o'er. I would feel that first returning, which within my soul was burning, when my star was quenched in darkness, yet to rise on earth no more, when I sank beneath life's burden in the streets of Baltimore." Sounds a little familiar to me. I think it's maybe derived a lot from The Raven. Just she ends each stanza with "in the streets of Baltimore" instead of "quoth the raven nevermore." But she wrote several of these poems. Here we see Resurrexy, The Prophecy of Vala, The Kingdom, The Cradle or Coffin, The Streets of Baltimore, Farewell to Earth. If you look at the table of contents closely, you'll also see that she's also written some more poems for Bobby Burns, and even a couple more Shakespeare poems written hundreds of years after his death. And here is Farewell to Earth appearing in a play. And the play was Beyond the Grave by John Franklin Clark from 1881. And he used some of her transcriptions as Poe's dialogue from this play. So the whole closing monologue from Poe is all taken from her transcription. So he says that, yeah, Poe helped write this play. And this is some of the poetry that appeared in the play. Farewell, farewell, like the tolling of a bell, sounding forth some funeral knell, tolling a sad refrain, not for those who rest from pain, but for those who still remain. So sweet pathos will I borrow from the loving lips of sorrow. Doesn't quite sound like Poe, but here's his little note saying it was taken from the published works of Lizzie Doden, who spoke with Poe while in an entranced condition, entrancing power claimed to be Edgar A. Poe. So this was all 1850s, 1860s, but meanwhile, Poe doesn't even have a marker for his grave. His relatives in Baltimore didn't get him one. Finally, about 10 years after he died, one of his cousins had a little marker carved for him, and it was in a shop next to train tracks, because these markers are heavy, so you have to have them close to the train tracks so you can carry them into the city. And a train smashed into the carver's shop and destroyed the tombstone. So the one we see now came a full 26 years after Poe's death, and it was paid for by fans of Poe's, by teachers and students. They started the Pennies for Poe campaign, and they got him this nice big monument with his face on the front. And they thought it's a shame to have him way in the back where nobody can see him. He should be up front. So they had Poe dug up and moved across the cemetery to the new spot where he is today. And on the way, the coffin fell apart. He fell out, gave everybody a last good scare. I think he might have appreciated that. Now there's a marker here on the place he used to be, and then another one on the place where he is today. But when the coffin fell apart, wouldn't you know it, people grabbed chunks of the coffin. On the left, this piece of the coffin is from the Enoch Pratt Free Library in Baltimore. The one on the right, big old piece of Poe coffin, is from right here in Richmond at the Poe Museum. We've got the best coffin fragment out there. Other pieces of the coffin were made into pins and pin holders. This is a little pin made from wood from Poe's coffin. And there was a writer who claimed that he was trying to write a biography of Poe to be called The Raven. And in 1909, the centennial of Poe's death, he started writing his great book. And for the first page, he was going to write chapter 1. He looked at the page, and instead of it saying chapter 1, it said Aranel. He said, one of the kids or maybe one of the servants has got into my study and they've written on this piece of paper. I'm going to try a different piece of paper. So then he writes chapter 1. And once again, Aranel turns out instead. So he said, there's something fishy about this. And then he notices that what's usually black ink in his pen starts flowing red like blood, and he gets blood all over himself. And he says, that's it. I'm not going to use this poem I'm not going to use this pen anymore. And he gets rid of the pen, and he can never figure out what this word Aranel means. He invites some of his friends there, and one of them thinks to put a mirror up to it. And it turns out Aranel is Lenore backwards. And the book was The Raven by George Hazleton. So I think this whole account was George Hazleton, generating some publicity for his book. I mean, I guess it's always possible the pen could have written by itself, but it seems a little bit more likely that it's just a publicity stunt. But the story later was filmed in 1915. It became a film called The Raven, which you can still find today on YouTube. But people ever since have been claiming to see Poe's works, including visual artists have claimed to have been inspired by Poe. James Carling, who did this illustration, he was born in Liverpool in 1859, so about 10 years after Poe died. And he only lived to be 29 years old, but he claimed that while he was trying to illustrate The Raven, Poe's spirit started to take over him. So his illustrations are better than everybody else's illustration because Poe was helping create them for him. But then Salvador Dali here, who during the early part of World War II briefly lived up near Bowling Green, Virginia, at the home of Cress Crosby as one of his sponsors. And he was working on his autobiography. And he said that every night, the specter of Edgar Allan Poe would drive up from the Poe Museum in Richmond to visit him and to help him write his book. And meanwhile, Andrew Jackson Davis here, he lived for quite a while after Poe, and he told time and again, sometimes embellishing his stories with each retelling, that Poe really was a secret closet spiritualist, and he really could communicate with the dead. He had clairvoyant powers. Even Sarah Helen Whitman here, that woman who was briefly his fiancée, said that he had powers, clairvoyant powers. He could see the future. He could read minds. He could control her. There's a description of them being at a party at other ends of the room, and he just stood up, and she was immediately drawn to him by his powers. And even today, people ask, is Poe really dead? They write him letters. So they send letters to the Poe Museum asking Poe to answer some questions for him. And it was only after his death, he died in 1849, but the Civil War came. He saw death at a previously unknown scale. Families would lose fathers, sons, brothers, go off to war we'd never be seen again. We don't know if they're living or dead. They'd be buried in mass graves far, far from home. So people once again turned to spiritualism. A well-known example is Sally Todd Lincoln on the left there, Abraham Lincoln's wife. Here she is in a photograph with Abraham Lincoln's ghost right behind her. You can barely make it. You can see his hands on her shoulders. The photographer claimed, he swore up and down that he didn't know that she was Abraham Lincoln's wife, but this picture of Lincoln mysteriously appeared behind her. But that became all the rage for a while, to have your picture taken with spirits who sometimes look suspiciously like your deceased loved ones. And these seances were still being held and still getting more and more elaborate. You know, knocking on tables was not going to be enough anymore. You needed furniture flying in the rooms. You needed slates that appear to be blank suddenly having writing on them. They even devised new ways to make automatic writing using this little tool that was similar to what they would later use in the Ouija board to create automatic writing. Although the Ouija board actually came along much later, the 20th century. But yeah, a spiritualist medium actually wrote an entire novel using a Ouija board, let the spirit write through the Ouija board. And probably the best known writer who's really inspired by spiritualism was Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, creator of the Sherlock Holmes mysteries. And he was a full out supporter. And Harry Houdini here was another one that he started his career as a spiritualist medium. He would go to towns and he would have somebody go ahead of him and check the newspaper obituaries, find out who died recently. He'd have them go check the cemeteries for recent graves and do background research for when he arrived. He'd be able to give readings and say, oh, there's somebody by this name that's dead. I've never been here before, so how would I know? But then when his mother on the left there passed away, he said, I really need to find evidence that she's still out there. And he worked going from one medium to another, trying to find evidence, trying to find a way to communicate with his beloved mother, until he was referred to a medium who wrote a letter to him from his mother that said, may the love of Jesus Christ be with you. I'll be with you forever. And she put a cross on it. And Houdini said to the medium, she's Jewish. She wouldn't have written that. And after that, Houdini went on the road trying to tear down these fake mediums and exposing all the tricks of the trade, which he knew because he started out doing them himself. So he knew about how they faked writing on seemingly blank slates. And he knew how they would slide out of ropes and play a musical instrument, then slide their hands back into the rope afterwards and say, I couldn't play that instrument. My hands were tied up the whole time. So this is a diagram of some of the ways he was exposing their tricks. Well, there's one of Poe's childhood homes in Richmond, Virginia here. And the woman living there in the 1880s said that she claimed that she and her sister would sleep in the upstairs room and they'd hear Poe's ghost walking up and down the stairs. And here's another place, Richmond, Talavera, out on West Gray Street. This is how it looks today. And the owner in the 70s, who was a big fan of Poe's, claimed that they would see a man in a dark hair and Victorian outfit that they claimed was probably Poe, because they knew that Poe had given his last private reading of The Raven in the house, that he spent time there. Here's his home on Amity Street in Baltimore. There's all sorts of stories about people seeing Poe, an actor upstairs, said that they were working upstairs and they had a window frame fall the window and almost hit them, and they refused to go on after that. And little kids spread stories they would see Poe's ghost jumping on the rooftop there, almost like a boogeyman of some kind. And one medium said that from the street, he could see Poe in the window sitting at a writing desk, or at least he said it was a man with dark hair and a mustache. It appears he's writing a poem about a raven. And of course, one of the members of the Poe Society immediately said, well, Poe didn't have a mustache when he lived here, and he didn't work on the Raven until he got to Philadelphia, so I'm not buying it. There was also a medium who claimed that Poe's spirit led him to the catacombs at Westminster Burying Ground. Now, Poe's buried here in Baltimore, but he's not in the catacombs. He's outside. Even in Baltimore, the Horseshoe Came On Saloon claims that this is the last place Poe visited before his death, although he actually died in a hospital, but we'll forget about that. And they save a stool for him, and you can't sit in that stool or you could be cursed. The General Wayne Inn up in Marion, Pennsylvania claims that sometimes you can see Poe's ghost sitting at one of the tables. Even the Fairmount Waterworks in Philadelphia, people claim to see him. That's where he spent a dark night shortly before his death. Fort Monroe here in Virginia claims that sometimes Poe's spirit makes an appearance. Even the Poe Cottage in the Bronx. This little cottage is still standing, but it's across the street from where it used to be. And a photographer named Kaplan, he was a paranormal investigator. He said that he took a photograph of Poe's chair and then only later saw a strange figure emerging from the photo that looked a lot like Poe. And today, these professional ghost hunting groups, we actually used to get so many calls that we actually had a part-time paranormal investigator coordinator here at the museum to deal with all the paranormal investigators who would call. And some of them have TV shows, but a lot of them we think are more just having fun with it. And I think a lot of them end up scaring themselves, alone in the museum at night. But I've never really seen any evidence of what's here, but you never know. There could be something lurking right behind me. This is Edgar, the Poe Museum cat. So now I'd like to open it up for questions. If any of you have questions, I'm going to check the comment box and see if there's anything there. Let's see what's in the chat box. Nothing down there. Does anybody have any other questions about Poe and his busy afterlife?
And feel free to unmute yourselves and just ask your question if you don't want to put it in the chat.
Oh, someone says, do you still do the unhappy hours? Yes, we do. Each month, the fourth Thursday of the month, we have an unhappy hour. It's kind of like a happy hour, except it's here, so it's very miserable. We get beverages and food donated from local restaurants and breweries, and we listen to live music in the garden, and you get to see the exhibits while you're here.
Oh, that's comical.
Speaking of happy hour, what's the status of that bottle of brandy or whatever on his gravesite in Baltimore that mysteriously appeared every year?
Well, the original Poe toasters, that's what they call the guy who would visit each year to have the cognac on Poe's grave on his birthday. It was always between midnight and 2 a.m. And that family started doing it in 1949, and they switched it up. They passed it down through the generations until 2009.
Very good.
And then they stopped showing up, and there's a new guy who shows up, but he's not mysterious. You can see his face and he plays the fiddle. We liked the other ones better because they were dark and mysterious, and people couldn't get close to him. They had to wait outside the cemetery fence and just peer through. The new guy just walks right up to you and plays the fiddle. He's too Hollywood for us, but we actually do have at the museum a couple of the cognac bottles on display, and we have one of the notes that he left on Poe's grave saying the torch will be passed, and that was before he passed it down to his son. And there's another one, do we know anything about Poe's religious beliefs? So he is brought up in the Episcopal Church. He went to Monumental Episcopal Church here in Richmond, and later on he seems to have dropped away from going to church because he attended only sporadically. briefly, when he was seeing a woman named Marie Louise Hughes, she started bringing him to church with her, but then he stopped going after she broke up with him. And then apparently at the end, he joined a group called the Sons of Temperance, which made him take a temperance pledge and join a church. So he probably started attending church again just in the last couple of months of his life. Do you have any other questions out there?
Well, if there's no other question, I'm wondering about the Mask of Red Death. Can we assume that has some type of pandemic or virus that was inflicting those people? What's the story? What is the background of that?
A couple different things. I think one of the main sources was the 1832 cholera pandemic. This started over in India and worked its way across Asia, Africa, Europe, and then came to the Americas, leaving millions dead. And this was on an unknown scale, especially in the United States, still a fairly new country. They hadn't seen something quite this bad. This is worse than the yellow fever outbreaks of the 1790s.
Mm-hmm.
And Poe was in Baltimore at the time, and he was seeing them take wagon loads of coffins to the edge of town to bury in mass graves. People thought the end of the world was coming. This was so bad. In Paris at the time, there were some people who rented out an opera house and had a big death party. They said, we're going to die anyway. We might as well party. So they had a masquerade ball. And at the stroke of midnight, some guy showed up dressed up like the Grim Reaper as the embodiment of cholera coming to get them all. And this was reported in a magazine edited by N.P. Willis, that guy that Poe knew. And Poe would have read this, and he very soon after that wrote a story called King Pest about people having a death party. But the basics of that idea of the masquerade ball and the guy showing up dressed as death, that finds its way 10 years later into the Mask of the Red Death in 1842. Now, that's published about May of 1842, but in January of that year, his wife was singing at the piano. He loved to hear her play the piano and sing while he played his flute, and his mother-in-law sang along. They'd have great times together. And then she started coughing up blood. And that was one of the symptoms of tuberculosis. She knew this was a death sentence. She wasn't long for this world. So I think it's no coincidence that in the Red Death, the sign of the Red Death is blood. Blood was its avatar and its seal. And here it was just a few months later, he published this story on the same topic, this plague that you can't escape. Prince Prospero tries to escape it. There's no way out. And darkness and decay and the Red Death held illimitable dominion over all.
His name is very interesting.
Yeah, he's not very prosperous, I guess. Yeah, you can't beat the Red Death. And people try to find all sorts of symbolism there. He has a castellated abbey with 7 rooms. Each room has a different color. One of these different 7 rooms indicate the 7 deadly sins, the 7 ages of man, all sorts of different ideas and symbolism that Poe doesn't answer. He doesn't tell you what this means. The important thing is that we just can't escape death.
Yeah.
So he wasn't in a good place when he wrote that.
I have one other, if you don't mind. I'm an avid reader of Doyle and Sherlock Holmes, and then I read the Murder of the Rue Morgue. Is there any possibility that Doyle was aware of Poe's coming up with this character with the power of deduction?
Oh, yeah. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle wrote a lot about his connection with Poe, and he said there really wasn't much original you could do after Poe, that he'd blazed the way for us to follow. He said that if all the authors who owed a debt to Poe were to give just a little donation, he'd get the biggest monuments to rival the size of the pyramids. And we think about this, A Study in Scarlet, that's 46 years after the Murders in the Rue Morgue. And the Murders in the Rue Morgue introduces this new kind of hero, the detective character, sort of an armchair detective. He's not a member of the police department. He solves crimes using reason and analysis, acute observation. And he has a sidekick who follows him around. So it kind of sort of sounds like Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. And the sidekick is basically there to make the detective look amazing. And there's a passage in the Murders in the Rue Morgue in which the narrator, the sidekick, and Poe's detective, he called Dupin, Auguste Dupin. He appears in The Murs in the Rue Morgue, The Purloined Letter, The Mystery Roger. They're walking down the street in silence for 15 minutes. And then Dupin immediately answers a question the narrator was only asking himself in his own mind. And he's amazed. How did you do this? How did you know what I was thinking? Did you read my mind? And Dupin says, no. I remember 15 minutes ago, you kicked this stone and I thought you were thinking about this. And you looked up and saw that sign. That led you to think about this. And then you looked at the horizon, at the sky, and you saw that constellation. That made you think about this other thing. And that's how I knew what you were thinking now. And it seems like really amazing, kind of far out there. But years later, there's a passage from Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, I think it's A Study in Scarlet, where he refers to that very passage. And
I remember it.
Watson says, you remind me of that Poe character Dupin. And then Holmes says, no, that was only a parlor trick. I'm way smarter than he was. So definitely that's his nod to Poe. But Poe preceded Wilkie Collins. He preceded a lot of these other detective characters that came along later.
Thank you.
I'm wondering if there are any other questions. We've gone a bit over time, but if you.
Hi.
Yes, one last question.
Okay, thanks. Because I was wondering if Griswold had not written his trilogy or his complete works on Poe, do you think Poe would have just faded out? Because really, it seems to me everyone you mentioned, including the Fox sisters, really was beating his drum to make a buck or fame. And so I'm sort of interested in your opinion, whether his poems would have ever reached their notoriety, or Poe himself, if Griswold had not come in afterwards and had written a number of volumes about him.
I think Poe still would have been known, especially in the scholarly community. During his lifetime, The Raven was an enormous hit, and The Murs in the Rue Morgue, The Gold Book are all big hits. So he would have been maybe known among other writers. So he might have been more like Longfellow or somebody who's mainly known among the scholarly community. But what Griswold did was he went through all the different magazines and all the newspapers where Poe had published things, because Poe published most of his things in the mass media. He didn't tend to publish his things in books, only did 2 collections of short stories in his lifetime, 4 collections of poetry. Most of his things were out there in the penny papers, and Griswold collected these things for the first time and got them in one complete edition. And that was enormous help, because between all these different printings, Poe would sell something to one magazine, he'd rewrite it and sell it to somebody else. Griswold was able to find the complete final authorized version of each story and compile them all together. So having that complete works, that really helped out Poe a lot, because that gave people access to a lot of the works they wouldn't have had access to otherwise, because The Telltale Heart was just a flash in the pan. He got rejected the first time he tried to get The Telltale Heart published. He only got $10 for it. It wasn't widely reprinted during his lifetime, like the facts in the case of M. Valdemar was. But because Griswold saved it and put in the complete works, now every 7th grader in Virginia reads it. And people all over the world know The Telltale Heart. It's even been on The Simpsons before. So I think he did an enormous job. And then making Poe a popular figure. He always started out popular, because Poe wasn't, writing for the elite audience in leather-bound volumes. He was writing for the mass audiences who could afford penny papers. And Poe told his boss at one point, don't worry what the critics say. We're looking to see what the circulation is. That's how we know if our work's successful. We're not trying to impress critics. We're going for the mass audience here. So Poe always was popular, but having that complete works really helped, and having that biography sort of made him a cult figure, because now people wanted to read something written by a genuine madman, somebody who was like Byron, mad, bad, and dangerous to know, who wandered the streets at night, obsessed with death. And they thought, man, I got to read that. So there's no such thing as bad publicity. And that bad publicity really helped Poe out.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
This has been absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much, Chris. I love that I now know where the word mesmerized comes from. Thank you for that.
welcome.
I'm wondering about the case of Voldemort. Is that where Voldemort came from, do you think, in Harry Potter?
I don't know where she got Voldemort or Voldemort.
Okay, just,
Well, we'll have to ask her. We'll have to write her and ask.
yes. Okay.
I was just reading about that name. That's so crazy about the Voldemort, and it's flight of death. That's what it means, which makes sense. The fact of
Oh,
how, Lord Voldemort was on Harry Potter. But literally about 2 hours ago, I was reading about that. So that is a little eerie. Sheila,
wow.
what you said.
I think it's a message from the great beyond. This has been wonderful. Everybody, make sure you go to the Edgar Allan Poe Museum in Richmond and be on the lookout for Chris's new book, Haunting Poe, His Afterlife in Richmond and Beyond. And it's going to be in the library soon. They are getting a copy, and it's also available on Amazon. So be on the lookout for it. Thank you again. This has been fabulous, really fascinating. We appreciate it. Thank you all for joining us, and take care and be well.
All right,
Thank
bye.
you all.